Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Taillebourg, fought on July the 20th, 1242, between the French army of Louis IX and the English one of Henry III and his French allies. This battle is a bit different from the ones that we are usually to tactically reconstruct because, as you can see also throughout the video, there is not really much of a major pitched confrontation to lay out, for example, on an extended battlefield and particularly complex tactics, combined arms, and so on. Given that this battle in and of itself was basically fought over a river crossing, and so it was as brutally direct, as sophisticated in some ways we will see now, in terms of military engineering and general tactical delicacy. As you know, crossing rivers, especially in front of the enemy, is something incredibly difficult and perilous. This battle, if anything, highlights in many ways, if you're not familiar with his other exploit, the extreme courage, bordering folly, but actually very functional, as we'll see now, of the great French King Louis IX, known as the Saint, given that he was sanctified, having died in one of his, not the first of crusading exploit against the Muslims of Egypt. In that case, he died in Tunisia before arriving to the east, but he had already been fighting there, and he had been captured in Egypt, as you know, eventually being released. So the epopee of Louis IX is so immense that, honestly, even as Schwerpunkt, I haven't yet felt the urgency, at least due to my own metaphysical limit, to browse to begin. This video is not the first in which we, of course, discuss Louis IX, his reign, essentially the might of medieval France in all its utmost splendor, for reasons that evidently escape a video dedicated to tactics. In the other videos, as we were saying before, of this kind, we tended to basically make extremely to the point reconstruction observations concerning the battle reconstruction. Surely we will look at battles of this period. We have made, for example, one about the Battle of Pelagonia. We talked about the Battle of Tagliacozzo, where the brother of Louis IX defeated, as you know, Conradin of Swabia, seizing the Sicilian kingdom for, in a broader sense, France, even though, of course, we're two separated things. So we are in and about these topics from quite a while. The Battle of Taillebourg is part of the so-called Saintonge War that is part of the broader wars and conflict revolving around the essentially the Angevin struggle against the French crown, being backed essentially by the English royal power that could afford to infiltrate, especially in this western, we're in Aquitaine basically, at Taillebourg on the Charente River, that together with the south had historically belonged, as you know, through especially the inheritance of Eleanor of Aquitaine, to in fact, to eventually what passed to be the kings of England, right, since the time of Henry II. And so here we are in the third generation, Henry III. I made a video about his English reign, was of course the son of John, brother of Richard the First. So again, it's a very fascinating picture. There are some characters such as Richard of Cornwall, the future king of the Romans during the German interregnum, that fought in this battle as well. This involved, as we'll see now, the House of Lusignan. And so again, it's a lot of stuff. In the tactical reconstruction videos, we focus, however, mostly on the clash, on the struggle. We will also look more at military historical units from this very period, mostly revolving around knightly effigies. And again, of course, here between France and England, we're witnessing an intensely feudal and chivalric warfare that, however, as I was premising, is in this case showing essentially a closed battlefield, and so a river crossing, a fortified defended river crossing, that shows one often, at least not overly popularized image of the men-at-arms. That is to say, actually the usual stormtrooper kind of ethos. In fact, this kind of closed battlefield, sort of akin to siege warfare, that instead was basically there, proving how, by the way, how dynamic the system was, and how not basically lockable just by, for example, one fortress or one river crossing, etc. It really was. And in this sense, it also highlights, because we are at the peak of knightly warfare, by the way. Medieval cavalry at this point has reached the technological, the economical, but especially the moral military superiority that would essentially never achieve back in terms of the individual professionalism, but also collective training and functionality of the men-at-arms per se. Right, in later medieval history, there would be actually even heavier men-at-arms, but in this sense, ever more in need of some tactical complement at a mounted level. So a very different scenario. We could actually digress on the art of war of the era, but this is not much the most typical battle you can describe in those terms. Again, the one of Tagliacozzo is, if anything, way more indicative of the more standard kind of great feudal clashes that you can imagine. Today we will proceed, however, by the usual steps, meaning reading the sources on the clash, at least the most important, the ones that allow us really to get most of the information of how things really went. Normally, like in order to write, to do something like this, right, you should pour months of work in a single article to examine really every single possible aspect. But even though, again, feudal civilization is at its peak, in many ways in these great national monarchical contexts, there isn't an overwhelming historiographical luxury, right? We, as we will understand now, actually know relatively few about the engagement, also because as this kind of engagement, there would be also not much more to describe than the French breakthrough on the English held bank defenses. There are actually other sources. Today we will read just three. The most important one is, especially from a tactical point of view, is Jean de Joinville in his Life of Saint Louis. Then there is the famous Matthew Paris. And then also another author, least known one, that is Guillaume de Nangis in his Gesta Sancti Ludovici. Right. Naturally, Matthew Paris, the Chronica Major, is also one of the great works of the era, is very insightful, etc. And it mostly laments, of course, the English defeat, big spoiler. Nevertheless, this is obviously always to be contextualized in a broader Anglo-French context, Anglo-Gascon, even depending on the degree, that we have already encountered, not just during the Middle Ages, because this thing drags on, well, also during the modern age in a way or another. What's the historical context? Essentially, the Capetians have just seized control on most of, in fact, southwestern France that had historically defined a bit like the Western Frankish, now properly French after Philip II, Royaume de France. The vernacular enters also the official titling. Dominance over, in fact, the former district, sort of Carolingian repartition of this broader lands that had, in fact, up to at least those 3-4 centuries before, not really been part of an organically and especially nationally cohesive land. We're also, however, witnessing at this point the victory of the Capetians after especially the not just the Albigensian Crusade, but especially the Anglo-German defeat at Bouvines, that I also recently made a video on, explaining, on top of the actual tactical explanation that I made for the entire battle, the deployment phase of the clash. That is quite interesting and highlights very important. We will make more of that, so we will come back on these already covered battles routinely to highlight and deepen a bit more the whole picture. So brief context here to be revealed. So essentially inspired by assurances of aid from the defiant Hugues de Lusignan, Comte de la Marche, whose rebellion was fueled by grievances over the French crown's appointment of Alphonse, that was Louis IX's brother, as Count of Poitou in 1241, undermining the Lusignans' family's regional influence and prompting youth to seek English support to challenge French authority. The same King Henry III of England initiated this military campaign to reclaim Poitou, which was one of the ancestral lands of the, at least at some point, owned by the Angevins, and especially in their Aquitanian legacy. In fact, the French had, the Capetians, if anything, had acquired this between 1224 and 1225. So the picture is quite straightforward. It's a usual French vassalic rebellion against the crown, requiring the intervention of the English that naturally had a concentrated force, not quite at this point competitive against the Capetians as a whole, because as we've seen, as we know, at least after Bouvines, most of the, aside from, the Bordeaux, say the Guyane, the most of basically the entire English presence, or at least English alignment and control in France had been lost, had passed under proper Capetian direction and dominance. So this shows, of course, how France was still relatively vulnerable, of course, as any other power of this period, regardless of the gigantic force that at this point was France was by far the greatest power in Europe. Obviously, that wasn't immediately translated in an absolute control, like, I don't know, today's a regional power with a contemporary, coercive level of political and territorial control. You could trigger some rebellions that, in this case, would not actually end that well. So also proving, given that the English and their allies spent quite some money to do so, that, of course, the French crown got it. So as we will see now, because we can't spoiler even a bit how the battle went, because it's literally how we described it, and that's the paucity of information mostly, if anything, can mostly help us instead to focus on the broader concept of this battle per se in its context. It otherwise is very, very common, very straightforward. As we said before, this is a typical feudal feud, right? A vassalic rebellion fueled by a neighboring crown competing with the Capetians. According to Matthew Paris, the combined forces of we will present all the major sources before reading them later, but in general what his background was. The combined forces of the English, their Gascon allies, and Poitevin supporters number 1,600 knights. This is not a negligible force in the era, all right? Say already armies with 2,000 men-at-arms were considered like really a big deal for feudal monarchic standards. Consider that here we are even before the peak, probably of the mid-13th century, so there is still a growth in theory of these feudal states. Besides, this is also somehow typical in these Anglo-Gascon enterprises. Of those 1,600 knights, only 80 were English. So basically you have just one knight over 20 that is English. And for the English crown, by the way, at this point, it's no joke to have 80 men-at-arms across the channel. Of course, they could have had more. On top of this, naturally, there aren't just knights. You must have already, this time, in military history, as always, like an auxiliary force. There are 700 hired crossbowmen. Remember how Richard I had, at the time, just Richard, because there wouldn't be another Richard for a long time. He had been killed, as you know, in France by a crossbow bolt during a siege. I have something incoming on, if anything, in the Brabançon, also in more or less similar context, except bits before this, in the 12th century. And we highlighted already in other videos how these forces were pretty darn good at infantry warfare, in the sense in an anti-cavalry function, even though, of course, they were mostly designed to cope with other infantrymen. But this is naturally interesting, mostly from a professional point of view. Of course, England could pay for troops by simply hiring them with that money in France without having to pay for extra shipping, logistics, and so on, which was, however, consistent, because here Henry III, by the way, was not really an overwhelmingly adventurous king. He tried, especially at home, to maintain sort of an internal balance, and this naturally entailed not a great deal of adventures abroad. Besides, this one failed. So we could explain the end of Henry III, the rise of his son Edward I, and that almost anglicizing. In fact, Edward had been called like that by his father after Edward the Confessor, as a matter of fact. As a consequence of that defeat at Bouvines, and so the loss of most French holdings of rulers that were fundamentally still French, but however now much more confined to their English and, if anything, British possessions, because tendentially there was an English imperial ethos very early on in Anglo-Saxon history towards the rest of the world, except the British archipelago and the Celtic Fringe. That's also another story. But we have also the exceptionally large, at least if we stick to the Chronica Major, number of 20,000 foot soldiers conscripted from Gascon towns. So this is actually a big engagement that, as we will see now, will not come to excessive fruition because of reasons we will explain now in the moral, rather than just the numerical ratio between the English and say the Anglo-Gascons and the French here. But 20,000 men is really a lot, right? I mean, the most updated Anglo-Saxon scholarship tells us that not even at the Battle of Crécy there were 20,000 infantrymen per side, right? So here it may be a sort of exaggeration. As always, we don't know exactly how many of these troops were actually fighting units, but Gascony was a fairly, say, urbanized center for French standards overall, and or at least had an important level of autonomy still at this point, because again, it's not like the Capetians had the possibility of really exercising an iron fist literally everywhere across the kingdom, especially in these more fringe realities in the southwest. So the Gascon towns that did not really want much French crown interference in their affairs are realistically fielding a pretty sizable infantry force, right? I made a video about the Bidault. It's mostly like a 14th century thing, but it already existed, right? So we don't have to think about ultra-heavy infantry, so radically compact, like also in other parts of the country. Probably those were actually the majority, but there were also lots of skirmishers, scorchers at Similia. In any case, we're not there to exactly verify the overall numbers. Besides, even if 20,000 infantrymen, 600 men-at-arms, by the way, had been fielded at some point, we're still looking, first of all, at a coalition force that, while typically medieval, was also more fragmented than the usual. I mean, the Capetians had a much more unitary control on the armies they could field at this point for many reasons. We discussed Western Frankish armies' mobilization history, so that you know how Capetian power had been relentlessly compacting itself during the generations. Here, which is a bit the same reason why the so-called Angevin Empire had failed, is that the often magnified sort of prosperity and wealth and effervescence of Aquitaine and this Atlantic, in part also Occitanian territories, it's mostly like not really the case compared to the sharper, the more stern and ultimately more organized, more hierarchically effective northern French world, which is in fact the one that imperially takes over once again these territories. Naturally, it's also not much of a national struggle as opposed to probably a feudal one, a political struggle over local autonomy versus, in fact, more direct control from other rulers. As you understand here, Duke of Lusignan rebels because Louis IX installs a Capetian as Count of Poitou. And this shows you how things were done, as we've also seen for the history of many French provinces in our historical regional series, as far as the installation of essentially a member of the great Capetian clan that was not just very rich but also very prolific, especially at this time, and essentially voiding the political autonomy of most of these principalities that once upon a time had been fairly quasi-independent, basically, and that now were mostly instead subjugated and functionalized to basically serve and support the French crown, and again, the pretty big armies that, as we'll see now also in qualitative terms, really kicked ass. So this is also a serious rebellion, again, a pretty large army of regional scale, right? In contrast, the French army led by King Louis IX, who had strategically mobilized his forces to assert Capetian dominance in the region and counter English ambitions, without which, by the way, these Gascons would have not really risen up, leveraging his recent consolidation of royal authority through administrative reforms and alliances with local lords loyal to the French crown, comprised a much larger, at least knightly-wise, 4,000 men-at-arms, and apparently 20,000 infantry as well. We can debate this. There are scholars who legitimately criticize these numbers, also provided mostly by Matthew Paris, that was partisan, as we will understand also in his narration here. So it's likely that these forces were much more balanced, but it's also possible and plausible that the French were numerically superior. As we'll understand, during the river crossing, this de facto equality in scale would balance very much the odds, but especially would favor the defenders quite much. So the crossing was a matter of will to power, and one also of chivalric spiritual inspiration. And you have a saint that is literally leading his army. And we will come back more, if anything, at least make more videos about probably the sacred ideal of the Capetian rulers, and how really did these leaders see themselves. Think about Philip II, that at Bouvines had officiated mass, right, himself. So it was not much just about being holy by anointing. It was a matter of virtue and of divine recognition of this de facto imperial power. So the 20,000 infantry from the French side as well are yet another indicator of the prosperity of the 13th century. The entirety of France, with its fat soil, rich agricultural lands, and enormous Atlantic plains, would provide striking resources. I mean, France was at this point towering in the history of civilization because of the enormity of its Gothic cathedrals. The English actually had, as you know, much of that too. In fact, these countries were pretty similar in many ways. And another characteristic that we really described in the Frankish system in post-Carolingian Europe is the fact that, differently from other civilizations, Western Europeans witnessed a feudal growth as much as they did of a communal civilization as well. I mean, these great kingdoms did not stifle the development of other communities, at least even where it happened. at some point. It still did not cancel them or sclerotize them, but it functionally integrated them in the hierarchical and corporative system of the time. I made videos about the medieval French communes that are probably a bit underestimated, especially by the largely feudal, courtly, princely literature that dominates these countries, that therefore wouldn't necessarily consider the third estate more than much, but the same Capetans politically and administratively did, as much as they were at this point needing to create also the foundations of a more efficient state that wouldn't remain just a feudal system, but in fact concentrate power further. Something that, for example, the English had more difficulty to do, especially as they had lost the French interland after Bouvines. And so there are really lots of things going on, including, in fact, the Third Estate participation even in the same French armies. Again, it's likely that these forces were slightly smaller, some sort, especially 4,000 knights from the French side seems a bit too much. But we can simply acknowledge that while the scale was similar, the French, as far as we understand, also because that's basically the only actual figure that we get from the sources, were numerically superior compared to the Anglo-Gascons. The opposing forces met at the castle of Taillebourg, that, as we will read now from Joinville, was, quote, located on a perilous river known as La Charente, where crossing was only feasible via a very narrow stone bridge, right? And this is also interesting because bridge battles, especially as choke points for these enormous forces, are really about who, holds the strongest, who can break, especially as an offender, that blockade de facto. As we'll see now, the battle will not take place solely across the bridge, but we romantically imagine that Louis IX would have charged head-on across the bridge, while, of course, a landing, a bank storming was occurring along the river to support the fort. And again, Joinville, as we will see later, does provide us some properly technical insight on how this operation was carried out. It's obvious that this strategic location, especially with the bridge, was critical because the control of this infrastructure was essentially for any army seeking not just to proceed, but in this sense to dominate the surrounding Poitevin territories that were, as we've seen, the broader political and strategical object of content, making Taillebourg a focal point for both sides' military objectives. Henry III stationed a robust guard at the bridge, obviously enough, in defensive fashion, anticipating that its narrow passage would bottleneck the French advance and allow his forces to exploit their defensive position. But when Louis launched a direct assault across the river, utilizing a pre-planned amphibious strategy that capitalized on the French navy's, we could say, expertise in riverine operations developed during earlier campaigns in the Loire Valley, by the way, deploying about 1,000 knights, sergeants, and crossbowmen in the operation using a fleet of boats and pontoons, the guard withdrew, fearing an attack from behind as well. We saw in the video about the Battle of Stirling Bridge how river warfare could happen. In that case, the English notoriously crossed, in fact, Stirling Bridge, and during the crossing, the Scots attacked them, and the knights were leading the advance, and essentially the English had been advised by people who knew the terrain to, if anything, send a flanking party upriver to cross at some point and attack the Scots from the rear as they were battling with the English. That at some point literally had to cut their way through back to the Scottish lines as they were being outflanked even by the bridge. And instead they wouldn't, and they collapsed. Naturally, that happened down the century, so It's not like these battles are mutually interconnected, but let's say as an example of how such operations would occur, preferably there would be some kind of flanking force that here we don't really see, but would have been possible. And there, remember, here there is the Kingdom of England from the other side, so there is already a lot of political relevance of any sort of military outcome. Again, the difficulties that the crown had to face from a financial point of view at the time, for example, when Richard had been captured, as you know, in Austria, coming back, rising up to Europe, to home, to England, rising up the Danube was a pretty obvious memento, but it's obvious that had Henry III been captured, things would have been really dreadful for monarchic power and the entire delicate balance that we described in Henry III's government video. So what you realize happening at Taillebourg is some sort of low confidence clash, especially from the English side. That is to say, they stood their ground on the Charente bank to essentially exploit the tactical advantage deriving from that position, hoping to inflict, of course, to the French king a sound defeat and hopefully regaining the initiative, because here there were naturally, as it often happens in these Anglo-Gascon versus French clashes, we've seen it also at the Battle of Poitiers, those are fought essentially in the same places almost, also during the 100 Years' War. But when they saw that the French were really committed to the crossing and they were really, committing heroic deeds at that point, they said, okay, well, they resisted, as we will see now, especially from Matthew Paris. We get the gist of sort of also the English stubbornness there, fine military performance. But they decided to say, this is we can't hold the bank. Let's withdraw. Let's fall back on Sainton in the south, which was also closer to the way that, of course, the Anglo-Gascons had come from. And obviously, this Anglo-Gascon retreat enabled the bulk of the French army to cross the bridge entirely. It's interesting how Louis IX committed, at least if we are, of course, to follow. This makes sense strategically, but let's say we don't know whether of this 1,000 knights were exactly 1,000, and if they were part of 4,000, so we don't know. But this may have been, if it's likely that this attack was carried out with 1/3. Being so, again, if you do it, if you really want to put yourself in this tactically delicate and extremely perilous situation, you have at least to attack with a consistent force that can really at least break through with greater possibility of success. Leaving 2/3 of the army in reserve is somehow fine. And even if likely, in fact, the forces that participated to the crossing were the spearhead of the formation, so probably the elite ones, also French nobility, you can understand how likely hadn't this been committed, the French would have likely lost. So the English at least gave up after they witnessed the full might and fury of the French assault, led by such a charismatically inspiring figure like Louis IX himself. Remember that this is a time in which kings really go into melee on a regular basis. And this is even more like the case of Saint Louis. It was kind of always the first to lend, like at Damietta, to risk his life, to lead by example. And this is very interesting because, a couple of generations before the same Richard Lionheart had been criticized for such enormous exposure to danger, to risk. But for 13th century warfare, and especially in a case like this, when you have really, and also the one at Damietta, for example, where you have a landing of some sort, it's interesting to see how these forces were being generally competent and definitely not shy to undertake amphibious operations as well, which they would have been always trained historically to do. Like, it's not like you really need to go to the Crusades or to find yourself at Taillebourg to do so. How actually functional such individual behavior of the commanders really was. Joinville notes that Louis' landing initially encountered strong opposition, of course, so we don't have to think again that the French were simply to win because they were the strongest or whatever. Again, crossing a river, especially with an enemy controlling the opposing bank, is one of the most traumatically dangerous military operations you can ever carry out. And that's why actually this battle stands out, regardless, in fact, of the, by definition, lower profile that it could have, as opposed to a sort of the commitment of the full force in open field with different battle lines in depth, flank attacks, etc. This, however, does not require less competence and expertise. Naturally, the Anglo-Poitevin forces attempted to exploit their numerical advantage. Remember, we committed just a fraction of his force, and in that sense, the Anglo-Gascons were superior. And especially, well, they had a lot of foot soldiers, as we've seen, and so also, generally speaking, greater, even culturally speaking, anti-knightly bias, right? The communes of northern France at large would have been more obedient to the feudal hierarchy, in the sense perhaps a bit less warlike, but that may be actually a stereotype as well. But let's say that the Gascons here in particular really hated the French a lot. They historically were a more countercultural force of sort of less developed society that fought more on foot, because that's also a lot of what they had by comparison. We've seen this well also in the video about the Battle of Poitiers. Again, there is in southern France historically a greater tradition of skirmishing, of foot combat, compared to the northern heavy cavalry shock tactics. And so there was some crude hatred towards the French nobility as well. And so this was the best circumstance to employ those footmen, right? Attacking, say, defending from this dismounted knights at most. On the bridge, they would have fought actually on horseback, but of course crossing the bridge. Well, as we'll see now with pontoons and other, both bridges and so on, the knights would have crossed also in full gear. It would have been difficult to do. Remember, if you fall, by the way, in the river here, the Charente is something like 30 meters wide, right? It's fairly deep. It's a fairly large, say, big river, consistent river, so the tactical break is consistent. Again, you can't cross this on foot, all right? And if you fall into the water, especially in full armor, you're likely not going to come up again to tell the story. And so it's a pretty dramatic engagement as well, with the infantrymen on the other side, especially wanting to puncture this men arriving, using bludgeoning weapons and etc. Without mentioning, again, 30 meters between the two banks. There is a lot of crossbow and other missile weapons exchange, which makes everything dramatically more intense. By the way, we should point out that the French actually controlled the castle from the other side, so the English did not really have the best control. Here they had arrived to, as we will see now better from the chronicles, to counter the French crossing, but the French actually had the fortifications from their side, so they could at least leverage them in some ways at crossbow range, I suspect, also to support the crossing from that elevated position. That may mean a lot as well. As we will see better now, the French managed to secure the bridge, and as soon as that in particular happened, Henry retreated to the fortified town of Saint, where things developed further also from a political, diplomatical point of view. We don't look at that mostly in this tactical, analytical videos, but we will talk about the aftermath of this battle a bit as well. Now, this Anglo-Gascon withdrawal was hastened by the collapse of Poitevin-Morel, as many local lords, wary of Louis IX's growing power and his ability to enforce feudal obligations, began to doubt the viability of continued resistance. That's why the political background is important. Besides, as we will learn here, especially from Matthew Paris, there were lots of French knights that were actually captured by the English, because arriving relatively piecemeal on the other bank at some point, even if the Anglo-Gascon resistance collapsed, they were carried away by the withdrawing enemies. This often happens. I'm just finishing an article to write an article of course, an instance where even in a victorious battle, of course, the winners could have some casualties in prisoners when losing, for example, one of the battle lines during the engagement, which is what can, again, always happen at some point, even if you finally win the battle later. And some of these men, in fact, would have been deported from the battlefield before the clash ended, exactly to secure them as political, diplomatic pawns for the further negotiations, especially also in case of defeat, to contain the damage, right, of the casualties that they also suffer on their side with, again, ransom asked. We will see, Matthew Paris in particular is detailed about that. The French, by the way, at that point, once they had won, pursued so closely the Anglo-Gascons that several of their soldiers entered the town of Saintes alongside the Anglo-Poitevin forces and were taken prisoner. Henry then dispatched his brother, early Richard of Cornwall, to arrange a truce with the French, a decision driven by Henry's recognition, of course, of his precarious position at that point and the need to preserve his remaining forces for, if anything, future campaigns in Gascony, a key English stronghold. This is obvious if you consider that even if they had basically lost the war, still the French had committed lots of their forces, and there's a broader political cost. You can't carry on a campaign forever, especially in the 13th century. Again, there are still very archaic means of committing your vassals and also paying mercenaries that do not really provide you with infinite resources. But of course, being beaten, like aside from the moral and the material losses, was a matter of, really of objective inferiority in this context, so that things would be settled in any case, not much in your favor. Gascony would remain in English hands as a launch pad for further operations, but the Battle of Taillebourg was also a general political defeat for the English. They didn't attempt much more after this. By the way, the same night after the battle, Henry fled to Gascony, because, of course, there he would have not been reached had the French pressured further. He would have been in great risk in the moment remaining there, so that he left his camp and supplies to the French as well. This was obviously in the peak of the chivalric age, not this enormous display of courage in particular. And so that's where you can argue that the French victory was that incisive. Hugues de Lusignan and other Poitevin rebels promptly negotiated their own peace with Louis, because also the English would come back to England. So like the Gascons were another people. It's not like the English and the Gascons liked each other in particular at all, but they were just having something in common in their hatred towards the Carpathians. In fact, what happens is that these Gascon rebels end up submitting to French authority in exchange for clemency and the retention of their lands, a pragmatic move reflecting also Louis IX's policy of rather reconciling with former rebels to stabilize the southern territories than going with, again, an iron fist. And it's a way of chivalric behavior that Louis especially cultivated as a champion of knightly mercy and sort of redemption offered to the fallen, so a gesture of nobility and honor, naturally compounded by the objective limits that, as we explained, the crown also had in waging a protracted war against subjects that now were basically given up anyway. So again, great victory of the French crown. The resulting 5-year treaty between England and France solidified French control over all their conquests, effectively ending English hopes of regaining Poitou and reinforcing Louis IX's strategic objective of consolidating French territorial integrity against external threats, which would allow not just his stature to be really towering over the ones of the various international rulers. Like, he was even called to England at some point to solve some juridical matters because he was the new Solomon of Europe. And again, a great soul, also a great mind. His greatest purpose was the crusade, for which, as you know, he created the royal port of Aigues-Mortes. As soon as the Capetians had the Mediterranean coast, they used that as a launch pad to further Mediterranean conquest, and especially the great dream of the crusade at this point directed at Egypt, that if collapsing, which we may think really hadn't Louis died in Tunisia in the second expedition, it would have actually happened. And after that, like, the road to Jerusalem is wide open. All right, so it was a great insight, and mostly a French-led strategy that was followed also by the English, like in the Aragonese. We've seen it in the video about Edward I, that when Louis died of the epidemics in Tunis, the only contingent that actually made it to the Holy Land was Edward I. These were enormous national contingents. Had the expedition gone on, that the Egyptians would have not really had the capacity to stop this, like in the first, at that point, only French expedition. So it's really, one of those painful realizations. Again, it would have been easy at different points during the Middle Ages for Europe to reconsolidate essentially what had been the Roman Mediterranean space under a single rule. All right, and these were definitely monarchs who incarnated that universal ambition, but also magnanimous breadth that had really characterized, in particular, Louis the Saint. So let's essentially read the battle accounts and understand better how this battle went. We'll start with Matthew Paris because it's actually the longest, the source providing the longest passage on the battle, and it's also the defeated perspective. So we'll confront this also with the French explanation is somehow smoother and less sort of, dark in the picture. We'll understand here how, of course, there is some, of course, partisan feeling, but it's a completely natural reaction, especially to this defeat. Matthew Paris was a 13th century English Benedictine monk and historian at St. Albans Abbey, Hertfordshire, England. A prolific chronicler, he is known for his extensive historical works, which combine first-hand accounts, official documents, and reports from travelers and dignitaries. His access to English court circles and continental informants made him a key recorder of a political and military event like Taillebourg in this period. The Chronica Majora is a critical near-contemporary source for the Battle of Taillebourg, offering the English perspective on King Henry III's campaign to reclaim Poitou. And written shortly after the events, it provides detailed insights into the military and diplomatic aspects of the war, making it essential for understanding the English strategy and the broader political context of the battle. Admittedly, as it's our habit for this type of videos, we do not delve too much into the campaign proper. If anything, again, this would be a great topic for another video, but we mostly reading the battle account. Fight of the King of England. The French king, in the meantime, having received the submission of several chatelains with their castles, became more confident and, raising his standard, directed his march towards the city of Taillebourg. This is a very fine city, rich in the great fertility of its vineyards, having a pleasant river near it, namely the deep and unfordable Charente, surrounded by rich meadows and crossed by a strong bridge. On the French king's approaching this city, the inhabitants, being neither willing nor able to oppose him by force, adopted a wiser plan and, going to meet him peaceably, surrendered themselves in their city to his authority, together with all their possessions and liberties. Because these areas naturally were the ones that the French king was reconquered, so that had partially rebelled. The king then received them into favor and took them under his protection, and at once entered the city, taking up his abode there with some of his nobles, the rest pitching their tents in a field near the city. On the following day, which was the Sunday next before the feast of Saint Mary Magdalene, Louis IX, crossed the bridge and made arrangements to proceed with his army to the more distant parts of Poitou. But information of this intended proceeding being carried to the King of England and his nobles, amongst whom the Count of La Marche was the chief, that monarch, by the Count's advice, drew out his troops by night, and suddenly came with his army to the field connected with the bridge, and pitching his tents there, he took up his quarters opposite the city, so that one army could overlook the other. It's interesting that this happened at night, by the way, and of course they knew what was going on, but in the darkness you can't really fight in any consistent fashion. Naturally, again, the river in and of itself was an insurance of sort of affordability, especially at night, but there would be pickets and skirmishes, by the way. The English king's army consisted of 1,600 knights, 20,000 foot soldiers, and 700 crossbowmen. There was a king on one side near the river, and on the other side, likewise near the river, was the other king. Early in the morning, the English beheld the oriflamme of the French king and the tents and standards of his army, whilst the other bank of the river was covered with a multitude of tents, appearing like a large and populous city. At this sight, the King of England, who expected nothing else than a battle, and that he should surprise the French at this war's point, some of the English being even stationed to guard the passage of the bridge, sent to the Count de la Marche, "Where are now your promises, my lord and father?" Stepfather, because he had married, Henry and Richard's mother was Isabel of Angoulême. When we were in England, you promised us many times by several messengers and certified to us by your letters patent that you would, when necessary, prepare such a force for us to be able, without any fear, to oppose the French king. And you told us only to trouble ourselves about money, right? So this is interesting because it's like Matthew Paris is sort of blaming you for essentially having over promised, especially as far as military mobilization. So this is shifting away the responsibility eventually for the defeat from Henry. To this the Count replied, "I never did so." By the way, Earl Richard, interrupting him, said, so you understand this is not a particularly tactical explanation, but it's interesting from a political point of view. Earl Richard, this is Richard of Cornwall, interrupting him, said, "You did, and I have now with me your letters patent in this matter." The Count then said, "It was never written or signed by me." At this, the king, in astonishment, said, What is this I hear from you, my father? Have you not often sent me and importunately begged of me to come here, both by your messages and by your letters patent, at the same time complaining of delay? Where now is what you promised? The Count then said with a dreadful oath, "This has never been done by me. Blame no one but your mother, my wife." This is, by the way, sort of too much fictional. I'm not even sure we should read this. Then, with another muttered oath, he added, "By God's troth, she has contrived all this without my knowledge." Again, this is not the best motivational background, of course, for a battle. And it's obviously like paving the way for possible excuses for the English defeat. Earl Richard, on hearing these words, disarmed himself and taking a staff in his hand crossed the bridge to arrange a truce, for the King of England was in imminent danger of being made prisoner. This took place on Sunday. On the Earl's arrival at the French army, he was received by them with the greatest honor, and numbers of them called him the Redeemer, because by the peace which he had made in the Holy Land he had released them from captivity. He was then summoned with respect into the presence of the king, and on making known to him his wish, namely to obtain a truce, it was, after some trouble, granted to him till the morrow. This he obtained for several reasons, because he was a person in great favor with the French, owing to his liberation of their nobles in the Holy Land. This is talking about the issue of Damietta, before mentioned again, because he was a relation of the French king, and also because it was Sunday. Which is interesting. It's interesting, of course, to know of the Oriflamme and the sacred son of the kings, eternally rising, in fact, as the ruler of the living from the French side. The French king, on taking leave on the Earl as he was departing, said to him, my Lord Earl, I have granted you this truce to last today and tonight, in order that you may deliberate as to what is best to be done in future, for night brings counsel with it. The Earl replied, on that account I ask the truce which I have obtained. He then immediately returned to the King of England and whispered quietly in his ear, Quick, let us remove ourselves from this place, for we are in imminent danger of being taken prisoners. They then took a hasty meal together, for it was noon, and as the sun declined, each man busied himself in collecting his baggage together. And when darkness came on, the king, who had now experience of the fate, or rather the faithlessness of the Poitevins, disgracefully retreated and did not spare the spoor. He was followed by the whole army, not without much danger to horses and men, for there were many of them dinnerless, and the horses were fatigued. The king, mounted on a swift horse, did not draw rein till he reached Saintonge. On the same night he peaceably crossed the bridge, and early in the morning of the following day the French pitched their tents in the same spot as the English king's forces had occupied. Their army was now increased by fresh arrivals of troops, and the wagons and carts carrying the engines of war and provisions, which were about 1,600 in number, extended for about 3 miles along the road. This is interesting, and by the way highlights a point that I am quite sensitive to, because I documented in some of my research, that is to say that artillery, siege engines, so engines that would be otherwise used, in fact, in other tactical contexts, were not a rarity in open field confrontations at all. If anything, because they were in part actually carried by the armies across the campaign. They were not only built in loco, and I will not digress on the, let's say again, the logistical and the other sort of technical implications of the wall. We know notoriously a few about, especially the smaller engines. But that is exactly what tells us about how actually frequent, because we get it from the sources that there is a lot of that, right? In the vagueness of the machinae of other Latin terms for this minor artillery, we actually know it was there and it was carried by the army. So imagine in a battle like the one of Taillebourg, how effective this would have been, for example, from the English side to sort of attentively stop the French assault. Naturally, these were not machine guns. They didn't fire shells. So obviously the warfare of the time was not quite affected by that, especially in open field. However, this is in fact not an open field. This is more akin to a siege of some sort, and or at least a fortification storming. All right. Obviously, the French would have had their own engines from the other side as well, so they could, create a barrage to trying to suppress the defenders. But it was a tough thing, as we've seen. The French actually had the upper hand of the castle at Taillebourg, differently from the English, because from the other side there is nothing. Like the town is from the French side. So that's an interesting picture. And so here we're still not in Taillebourg. Matthew Paris goes on and says, on the Tuesday following, the French king with his army set out in pursuit of the King of England, and on approaching Saintonge, some of the French who were wandering about intent on collecting provisions, commonly called foraging, were met and attacked by the Count de la Marche, right? So this was the rebel that had led the enterprise. And this is interesting because it shows some skirmishes out there. Typically during the forage, right, there would be some, especially foot troops scattered across the land, not obviously in battle array, and so exposed. And normally it was a cavalry reserve overlooking the plain where the foraging was being carried out. And at that point, there would be a counterattack. In fact, this is how it goes. Matthew writes, as the two parties rushed on one another, loud cries were raised. On one side, King's men, King's men. On the other, Montjoie, Montjoie. This is interesting, because probably the idea of kingship and royal prestige was very deeply seated in England from a long time. Montjoie refers to the famous battle cry of the Mountjoy in Paris, together with Saint-Denis, was all one with also the Oriflamme and other sort of symbols, properly of war, the imperial identity of and higher sort of divine connection of the Capetian house. And before that, right, also since Merovingian times, the Montjoie is a sort of Asgard / Olympus, right? If you really want to get the meaning of that, we're not talking about the Oriflamme, that is obviously a solar symbol and one of the most powerful ones of the eternal rising as king of the living from the French side. We discussed this in the videos about sacred royalty. So again, interesting perspectives. The shout. So obviously, this is a nightly clash. There are infantrymen alongside, but these skirmishes were always important to test the enemy muscles and morale. So even smaller engagements could actually affect the broader picture. Von Clausewitz says that there are some militarily minor clashes and outcomes that, however, resonate for political reasons more than they should, and they actually end up having some greater military consequence. Here, it's partly the case. It says the shouts of the combatants reaching the King of England as Saintonge, and he was told that the Count de la Marche. This is beautiful. Thinking, imagining. Hearing in general in these plains in the 13th century. Imagine how beautiful France could be. Clear sky, limpid water. Imagine the battle cries in the darkness of this clouds, this thundering clouds concentrating far away, and allegedly hearing that even the battle cries or how loud they were in a world that did not even know firearms, apparently, yet we don't fully know, but it's really poetic and beautiful to read. And he was told, Henry III, that the Count de la Marche, as he had commanded the war, wished either to lose his life or redeem his fame, because this had been, as we've seen, insulted by the French in the moment in which they had disposed of his position, being all one with his rebellion. The armies on both sides being now aroused, a fierce conflict, aside from the translate conflict, does not translate as the first clash, let's say, took place outside the town of Saintonge in a narrow roads between the vineyards. This was also interesting, some kind of quasi-urban warfare in a fortified with some among buildings, etc. This was typical also of tournament warfare of the era to an extent, right? In the vineyards, having these, in fact, non-typical sort of narrow, flat corridor for orderly cavalry clash, but sort of dirtier, and dismounted combat, these knights were excellently trained for all of these endeavors. The English, in their rage, attacked the French at the sword's point and fought most desperately, so that if they had equaled their enemies in number, they would have succeeded in gaining a glorious victory over the French, as the latter themselves bore evidence after the battle. So the notion is that in this clash, the English were also apparently inferior in number and they were defeated. Basically, Matthew Paris is not actually even describing the battle per se. He's just talking about the secondary clash, where he analyzes mostly the fact that the English had redeemed themselves to some degree, and or he attributes to this retreating fashion the actual, this sort of self-sacrifice to parry the retreat of the king. So it says, in this battle, Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, the Earls of Salisbury and Norfolk, Roger Bigod, John de Burgh, Warren de Montchesnil, Hubert Fitzmatthew, Ralph Fitznicholas, and many other brave Englishmen gained lasting renown, and even their rivals allowed. So he's basically now attributing these deeds mostly to the this clash rather than the war. On the French side, John de Burgh with 6 knights was taken prisoner by William de Say, but they were afterwards exchanged for a like number of English prisoners. Many others of the French also were taken prisoners, amongst them Perret Riche, seneschal of the Count of Boulogne, was taken by John Mansell, a clerk and a special counsellor of the King of England, who was reckoned not at least among brave men. Of the King of England's army, Henry Hastings was made prisoner with about 20 knights and a large body of foot, but they were all given in exchange for Jean de Burgh and those who had been made prisoners with him. So basically, as you have understood here, Matthew Paris skips the major clash by, say, at Taillebourg, by the bridge, and he seems to do so for trying to hide properly the general defeat and blaming the outcome of all this to the Poitevin, to also for political reason, the stepfather, Hugh de Lusignan, of the same King of England. And this is naturally disappointing because, as we will read now, things went differently. It was an actual battle, an actual clash that here is basically shadowed by a rhetorical discourse. And this, if anything, gives you... It's a pity because, as you understand here, Matthew is fairly precise, right? So it's not really... he's really telling everything except the clash. And so this does not explain the climax. He also goes on later to explain that it was the Count de la Marche's fault and all this stuff, but he doesn't talk about the battle, which is the bad aspect of this. And so this is sort of somehow outrageous in literary terms, historiographical terms, but it tells you, if anything, how authors tied to the court would at some point deflect also responsibility, etc., which, by the way, given the premises we have made, is understandable, as the general behavior of the King of England had not been extremely chivalrous. All right, and again, Henry III was not such a bad ruler overall, but he was definitely not a soldier, right? He was not definitely a great deal of a fighter per se. And here, the French actually humiliated him in ways that would have actual repercussions at home. Let's instead read Jean de Joinville, that, as we also cited him in those videos about medieval knightly combat psychology, provides us with some of the most insightful passages in 13th century warfare, knightly ethos, and chivalric ideals, and also their sort of the shortcoming of many. towards them. Jean had been born around 1224. He was a French nobleman and chronicler who served as a close companion to the same King Louis IX. He participated in the Seventh Crusade and later wrote the, Vie de Saint Louis around 1309 as a memoir combining personal observations with a biographical account of the king. So as you understand here, he was basically 18 when the battle was fought, which is quite interesting, and this was a hell of a life to live, by the way. He lived well up to his 84 year of age. It's pretty extraordinary, at least, especially given his quite adventurous life as a crusader at the king's service and really witnessing a lot of warfare. In fact, his direct involvement in Louis' campaigns gives Jean's work a unique eyewitness perspective on French military and political activities. The Vie de Saint Louis is a vital first-hand source for the Battle of Taillebourg, written by someone close to Louis IX. It provides a French perspective focusing on the king's leadership and the tactical elements of the battle, particularly the strategic challenges posed by terrain. Its immediacy and personal detail make it invaluable for studying the French side of the story, which we're exactly going to do now. The account is simpler, telling the truth. So, again, we've seen Paris tends to mostly flatten the thing to balance out even the level of, people who had been captured or not, focusing on this other kind of context. In any case, here's Jean de Jonville's account. Shortly after the king's return from Poitiers, the King of England came into Gascony to make war on his fellow monarch. Our saintly king rode out to fight against him with as large a force as he could get together. So overall, the notion that there would be tens of thousands of troops from both sides is accurate and makes actually what happened at Taillebourg even more remarkable, as this could have been a pretty intense clash. Also, once the French had made it on the other bank, like the thing could be fought out, but Henry III, as we've seen, behaved differently. Joinville says the King of England and the Count de la Marche advanced to join battle with him before the castle of Taillebourg, which stands beside a wretched little stream called La Charente, at a point where one cannot cross except by a very narrow stone bridge. He cannot cross, right? So this is interesting because even though, as we've seen, the river could be crossed, hadn't there been really the bridge to channel, to funnel in properly an elite force, there would have not really been a breakthrough, a bridgehead, in fact, to consolidate the landing as well. So that part was crucial. Jean says, as soon as King Louis reached Taillebourg and the two armies had come in sight of one another, our men who were on the side of the stream where the castle stood spared no efforts to get across to the other side. With great risk to themselves, they passed over the stream in boats and on pontoon bridges. So this is key. They had established this measures, this supports boats and pontoons. Imagine even just like the general preparation of this under the enemy fire, because the pontoons may have been carried in other ways. Again, it was not an excessive distance, but in order to lay them down, we had to establish them in lockwood, so it was not easy. Then a fierce and furious fight began. Joinville says that the king, who saw the way things were turning, rushed headlong into danger with the others. But for every man he had with him when he had crossed the stream, the English had at least 20. And this is, again, the most interesting part of the story. The fact that basically Louis charges head down across the bridge, and he finds, obviously, outnumbered on the other side. And Joinville says, nonetheless, as God willed, the moment the English saw the king cross over, they lost heart and fled for refuge to Saint. This is, again, also very interesting because it is what apparently happened for some reason. And either, here there is always the thing, we don't know whether a flank part existed. Maybe there was an actual French flanking party that was spotted and the English got out of the way. Besides, as we've seen, Matthew Paris says that there was a guard at the bridge and these were taken out. So maybe they had lost heart seeing these men, losing to the French and fearing that this could cause sort of panic to probably demoralize the entire array, like they left. Possibly also because the French were numerically superior. We don't really know. It was probably a combination of factors. Normally, feudal literature does not speak of flank parties. The official, for example, version of the Battle of Tagliacozzo does not mention the hidden reserve. This also happens, especially in more concise accounts of other battles of the 13th century, especially from feudal countries. But here we don't even have an hint specifically. In any case, here is the thing. Joinville says, some of our men followed them into the city but got entangled in their midst and were taken prisoner, which is essentially what Matthew Paris describes, as we've seen in the end. And so it's an interesting situation because the attempt was properly overrun. The defenses were sent after this breakthrough. Imagine the English having to withdraw, by the way, pressed by the French, and so having a relatively little time to entrench into the settlement. This is, again, all quite interesting in a way. And Joinville says, those of our people who had been taken as sent reported later that they had heard talk of a serious quarrel between the King of England and the Comte de la Marche, in which the king had accused the Count of sending for him on the pretext that he would find greater support in France. So this is somehow probably derived from a possibility that this was the case, but also probably Matthew Paris's account, because these sources are somehow influenced. I mean, Joinville writes later, and so Matthew Paris at that time was well known as well. And this is a way to also explain, in part, as we've seen, the sort of the lack of cohesion from the Anglo-Gascon side. And so this could explain why this force had withdrawn anyway, because the French were apparently more compact in any case. They had to cross the river, and so they had to fight it through. But if you find scarcely cohesive enemy force at that point, for whichever reason, it is not strictly military, if you mostly equal each other by scale, you can see how it can create a problem. War is a struggle between moral forces that reciprocally influence one another. If there is a problem from the English side when they realize that the Gascons have provided less troops than they thought, probably and especially knights, that Matthew Paris may be true, really, because that ratio is less than half, right? And the English had few properly national troops, right, alongside Henry and Richard, right? So it sort of makes sense, and it can't be actually one reason why the thing really went the way that. And this is literally the account of Jean de Joinville that at least tells us about the fight by the bridge. And so we don't know exactly how it happened, but the fact that there is this desperate moment in which the king is needed properly to charge across the river himself, so finding himself outnumbered, but somehow managing with his presence to have the enemy collapse, because this is eventually what actually happened, is quite fascinating, and it sort of fits well with the overall legion of Saint Louis. All right. Finally, we read even a smaller account, the one of Guillaume de Nangis, just Sancti Ludovici. Guillaume was a monk and chronicler of the Abbey of Saint-Denis. So obviously the most properly spiritually beating heart of France. France is Saint-Denis, and Saint-Denis is France. If you don't know this, you don't know what France is. Besides, the Abbey was a major center of French historical writing in late 13th and early 14th century, and his Gesta Sancti Ludovici, written after Louis IX's canonization, is essentially an hagiographic chronicle designed to celebrate the king's life and achievements, drawing on earlier records and oral traditions to emphasize the Capetian dynasty's legacy. The Gesta serves as a later French source for the Battle of Taillebourg, focusing on Louis IX's role in the victory. And while not an eyewitness account, it compiles information from contemporary traditions to highlight the battle's significance in consolidating French authority in Poitou, making it a key text for understanding the political implications of the event from a French perspective. There are actually other sources that talk about this, but they are sort of smaller ones, less known ones. Maybe there are some interesting details, but they're very difficult to find even in a properly digitalized version, and they are somehow, however, minor sources of sort. And here we can, however, simply read, if you search for them, for example, it's sort of strange because, again, this are important historical events, but somehow they are shrouded a bit in mystery, and the best narratives are the ones that we just read. However, Guillaume says, however, they were approaching the main body of the enemy army gathered around the vicinity of Saintes, and the king was eager to join them. He stopped again at a castle called Nantas, protected by a strong square tower that was raised after the siege, then at a fortress called Chorin. The besieged, frightened at the sight of the large king's army, preferred to give up the fight rather than face his anger and resentment. They hurried to surrender without weapons, offering him the keys of the castle. These frequent skirmishes barely delayed the march of the army. The king arrived with his troops near a marsh overlooking the city of Saintes, where the King Henry of England had established himself. It was agreed not to cross the other side. The following day, which was the eve of St. Mary Magdalene, and you understand how this is also connected with the previous sources, by the way. The king moved towards Taillebourg, a castle belonging to Geoffroy of Rancune, built on the Charente River. The army was ordered to camp on the river bank. On the opposite bank, the enemy army was visible. King Richard of England, his brother, the Count of Cornwall, Count Hugh of La Manche, Simon de Montfort, the Earl of Leicester, and a large number of knights, crossbowmen, and other armed men in war. The arrival of the French king's troops prompted Henry to retreat a double crossbow shot away. Along with all his men, he feared being too close to his liege lord King Louis. So this is obviously an hagiographical explanation, but it doesn't lack of moral consistency. Taking advantage of the movement of the English army, the French immediately crossed the bridge with 500 well-armed sergeants, then a crowd of crossbowmen and other foot soldiers. When Count Richard, brother of the King of England, saw the French crossing the river, he laid down his arms and ran to them, begging them to summon Count Artois Robert to negotiate a truce. But he, before agreeing to his request, first wanted to consult the king and disappeared toward the royal pavilion. When the English, seeing him not return, were seized with fear and fled towards Saintes. Which is interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, we're told that there were some well-armed sergeants that crossed first, with crossbowmen following them, and other foot soldiers after them. So this tells us that there was a consistent amount of forces, especially infantrymen from the French side, who were actually pretty darn good. They had been equipped ad hoc, especially the sergeants, and we made videos about them, explaining a bit who these guys were, sort of B-series knights of sort, even though they were not knights. They were soldiers, essentially, and increasingly armed and armored as men-at-arms, basically, and they were tasked with this more perilous missions, given the fact that they were more expendable in a way or another, right? So you would understand how this event occurred. This is where, by the way, you see, we don't have much detail about how the battle went in the various phases. We can imagine, of course, the French crossing different points, and so endangering sort of the English positions. However, there were disposed. Remember, the French have the castle from their side. The English do not really have much overall protection. They had just arrived, probably not had the time to dig in. And here there is the passage when Richard of Cornwall is sent to Parliament with the French, and the narrative of Matthew Paris is different. Here, basically, we're told that Richard wouldn't come back, and so the English were worried and they fled. As we've seen in Matthew Paris's account, instead, there is more like the French receive the Earl, and they are all nice with him, and it gives the English time to essentially retreat. So we can imagine, of course, that the battle was fought at the bridge, and that would have been a most hotly contended place. We can also imagine some different waves, different timing. I mean, the timing would have been pretty carefully organized. Like, these clashes were never sort of random, simply testing. It would have been, as we were saying at the beginning, fully organized according to a very specific pacing and rhythm of the attacks, combined arms, as we've seen here. The last source provides us properly with an idea of that there were some assault troops, and then others followed, mostly infantry, by the way, to secure terrain and entrench in some way. This speaks of a complexity of the array and some sort of looser position from the side of the English. We unfortunately can't picture this too much better. Again, I would have actually consulted, as I did, other sources, but these are somehow lost. They're difficult. I found them in some, say, some didn't actually speak of the clash in relative terms. Others were almost barely legible because they were, I don't know, the only publicly accessible ones. And again, the informations I have also from the scholarly literature that I consulted is basically modeled on Matthew Paris and Jean de Joinville. But I wouldn't exclude there to be some slightly greater information, not too much, not too precise, but for example, what Guillaume here says about the section of the troops, the segmentation of the troops during the assault is fascinating, because there is also combined arm, heavy, light troops, missile troops. So that is mostly the picture, all right? It's a pity, again, that Matthew Paris does not tell us exactly what happens at the crossing, at the bridge. It's all essentially very, very vague. But it's all relatively vague also from the French side. I mean, we can imagine a pretty intensive clash at some point, but not one that would be otherwise particularly recorded. Again, it's typical of the closed battlefields where you can't properly picture what in too much detail. Like in a siege, how do you explain that? All right, you should explain probably all the timing, the pacing of the crossing, etc. We are told how the French as a whole basically crossed, and with some minimal understanding of like this picked units properly designed. Louis IX would have supervised the mechanism, by the way, and as we've seen, he charged himself at some point getting on the other side, which was sort of a duty for a king, and also showing to this hesitant Henry that likely realized that his forces on the spot were not strong enough to resist the French onslaught, that it was better to withdraw. But this was, if, again, all that story reported by Matthew Paris really true, still sort of a very poor way of organizing the campaign and the entire situation. There is a general hastiness in the way the English got, as we've seen on at Taillebourg, without too much entrenching. And so the French are depicted normally as a sort of well-organized host with a large camp, and everything fits like the general description of, even strategically, we would have this camp from the other side, say, from the open side in the northeast, on the French side of the bank beyond the castle, so well repaired. Again, the French had all very substantial advantages of some kind, and this is also how they managed to leverage that, probably by commanding the crossing of the bridge as well, perhaps from the castle. Again, the distances are at crossbow range, so it's possible, as we've seen, how that the crossing was carried out under crossbow cover and catapult cover by sending also other crossbowmen across to secure further gradually other positions. If, of course, from the Anglo-Gascon side, things had been sort of better managed, had there been a more uniform deployment and commitment, things would have gone differently. But it is exactly the fact that they wouldn't to make us talk about what happened. So again, relatively foggy picture that we can't better explain, but this is literally, believe me, what the secondary scholarship tells us about this. Like, there are many studies highlighting at some point like this synthesis of battles that are notable, mostly because they involve these kings, right? These are encounters, for example, you find in the summaries of, the War Games series, mostly from the Anglosphere, that tell about this, again, admittedly peculiar encounter, but one that maybe was remembered just because it was, how many of these clashes happen in other contexts. Well, this is in particular explained, right? We know that, speaking of other sources, by the way, that Vincent de Beauvais' Speculum Historiale, there is a French perspective, still aligns with Paris, as Guillaume de Nancy, as we've seen, actually does. Other sources do not really talk about this too much, by the way. And there are later sources that copy these other sources mostly. So that's, I imagine, again, by scrapple, I should have read till to the last source existing in this, but these are really minor compositions that haven't, because all the data, again, that I found also in secondary scholarship, I found in these three sources, right? So it's not an excuse. If anything, I can dig better at some point, but this is also what most seemingly happened. Does this overall satisfy the strategical picture of the war? Well, yeah, we basically are told what happened, and it doesn't seem that strange, telling you the truth, right? It seems like a credible picture where you can essentially appreciate the general. I'm looking at the aerial picture of Taillebourg, and perhaps the crossbow shot at 200-300 meters is barely making it across the Charente, telling the truth. But considering that the castle would have been further fortified closer to the river banks, and of course, like, there are buildings still today on the Seine, like, that would have actually crossed the river. So again, it's not too much of a long distance, but see, this is like 30-40 meters across the bridge. There would have been catapults capable of shooting greater amount of, a greater range, pretty big projectile. So we can imagine mostly that was done. But as we explained at the beginning, it's not this cover that would have made the thing. It's about the actual assault troops. It's the amphibious operation. It's the organization. It's the military engineering, the pontoons, the boats. However, the French were able to find them in sufficient numbers. And this is again interesting because overall it's a proof of the times. Louis IX's charisma, leadership shine through. The enemies melt away as soon as he crosses the river. So it feels all very ghostly and solemnly plausible, accurate, and in line with the general spirits of the era. The military culture is there. The struggle on the riverbanks would have absolutely occurred, because it's not like the Anglo-Gascons were sitting ducks where the French were crossing. There was this detachment, as we've seen, crossing, guarding in particular the crossing at the bridge, and so this failed to produce much of a result. We think here that, again, Louis arrived on the opposite river bank after, as we've seen, other units had secured a position, because otherwise it would have been really too reckless to carry out such an operation. But it's also interesting to notice that when, at least sticking to Jean de Joinville's account, when Louis arrived, the situation was not really very positive. It was not resolved, and it was mostly this apparent collapse of the Anglo-Gascon coalition, if anything, for broader reasons, naturally connected with the strategical ones, right? If they had been compact, they would have withstood this, but there was still a fight raging on, and so likely Louis IX's intervention was resolutive, was decisive. Again, there is no indicator, in my opinion, regardless of what Matthew Paris here basically wants us to believe, that this was not a closely fought battle, right? I've read too many battle accounts to presume, but especially the bigger the engagements, the more the less they would be eventually fought out. Like this large force that the same Matthew Paris puts, by the way, 1,600 knights and 20,000 men. Yes, it was inferior in men-at-arms to the French, and that was the greater problem, as we have noticed. But is this enough to explain, especially given the pretty wide river and the fact that, as a whole, there was a pretty sound tactical advantage? If anything, by that position on the other across the river itself, on the opposite bank to Taillebourg, for the Anglo-Gascons, that regardless of their lack of cohesion and scarce entrenchment, could have really worked against the French army as well. So again, things were poorly managed. We can't think so for these reasons. But there was also pretty consistent clash, and we have observed also how many notable knights were captured from both sides. Also, the process through which we seek this information is important, because we go by, again, all the standards available. I make especially for medieval battles that I was saying before, for reconstructing them, it takes months. So I mostly gather the primary sources, and I read the scholarship on this, which is usually not particularly developed. Right, I'm not aware. There are some instances of descriptions of these battles, but in depth and ad hoc, but by secondary sources. But they're so modern scholarship mostly. But in fact they stop to the very information that eventually you find in the primary sources. And so, aside from the secondary sources the secondary mean this sort of almost B series. I mean, sources, less important sources that actually add always something new. You don't see the whole narrative altered very much, actually. There is like in this case, a pretty evident gap also in the story of Matthew Paris, or at least there is an avoidance of the particular topic of the French crossing. Joinville also provides with a pretty concise account, so there are different views on the places, on the actual circumstances, which is fascinating, because it tells you also how politically loaded these views really were at large. There is always some kind of connection with this, and there is also a general proximity to the events. And actually, Joinville wasn't there, right? But he was close to Saint Louis later, and he had already met him the year before, right? What would become Taillebourg. And so it's all very interesting, and consider that he was writing this stuff at the time of Philip IV. And so it was also a very different time, and probably historiographical approach. He had lived literally to his times. Those times he knew a relatively young Saint Louis as well, on the sovereign's account. But the reasons why he was writing were relatively, as you understand here, not excessively even interested in the detail, into many details. We get the details of the pontoons, of the boats. They're very interesting, but we don't get too much. We just get some few scattered hints from secondary sources like Guillaume of Nangis and from the idea of the guard left at the crossing by Henry III. So again, everything is mostly settled on seemingly on the basis of the alliance between the English and the Gascons, and especially in the shortcoming of the second. It's not like even Henry III was a bad ruler, etc., but it's the broader display of lack of unity and power that, of course, gave the measure of the Capetian success in this battle. For the rest, it's, as I was saying, not a battle where you can get the same level of insight on the major, bigger ones. Even Bouvines, there was a smaller one, or at least where smaller armies were involved, is enormously more detailed and more sort of tactically complex and explainable, and in that sense, quite rationally and linearly described. Here, Paris is the lead, and other sources add Joinville is also aware of Paris's account, and he adds something else, but there is not any other major analysis of the clash, mostly because Paris skips, as we've seen himself, the moment of the French crossing. So we are making, and I'm glad about this, ever more medieval French content. I'm one of the few channels that actually does this, and it's I also created a playlist about France and England, medieval France and England compared, which I think is relevant in the broader picture, not just for the 100 Years' War, but because you understand these theaters were basically just a continuation or the premise to that. And so it's all really calibrated to the degree of interest that you have in the specific event. But talking so much about these events and these lands and these rulers compared to whatever I've actually seen on other channels, I think is quite relevant, right? With Schwerpunkt, we began a bit with the Burgundians, then we passed more to the Capetians. There is still so much to do, really, and we're moving the first steps towards a more comprehensive direction. Again, I think that talking about the Battle of Taillebourg is adding yet another tacit, another piece to the puzzle, and hopefully expanding more, especially on Capetian warfare. We also have to talk about Angevin warfare, talk about also an exquisitely sort of British dimension of English warfare as well. We did a bit, at least looking at the campaigns of Edward I, mostly from a political standpoint, say a governmental history, not necessarily a strategic one. So again, I think that Taillebourg is a fascinating battle, and you can learn a lot from that if you're really into it and into the period, the general vibe, the times, etc. And again, it's a pity, it's disappointing, or at least, as always with these accounts, their incompleteness, like it is still indicative of some important historical datum, right? It's never random. It's never something, say, that happens for no reason. It's the direct reflection of that historical background. In that case, the lack of cohesion between the Anglo-Gascon allies and the greater sort of spiritual legacy of Louis IX in this extraordinary feats of arms that he was definitely not a stranger to. Again, there are lots of other political implications here. If you've seen, there had been an English involvement even in ransoming Saint Louis and his knights during the Seventh Crusade. There are lots of interesting things that tie, especially France and England, to an important degree. If anything, we shall make more political history also to explain what was going on in France, in England, especially in France, because we haven't covered that much in this period, and then everything would be even more complete. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.